Welcome to my March essay. This is part one of a two-parter called Circus and Physical Literacy. Part one, WTF is physical literacy. What the fuck is physical literacy? In part one, I'm going to unpack what physical literacy is, and in part two, I'm going to talk about its relation to circus. I hope you enjoy, and when we come across links in the text, you can just grab the PDF or the link or anywhere else where you're getting this, and click the link, because a lot of them are funny or interesting, so they're worth checking out. Here we go. Have you ever heard of digital literacy or financial literacy? What about physical literacy? I love to think about literacy as specific to different areas. There's something really juicy and organic about it because when you think about it, this word literacy is one of those sandcastle words, a word that seems really sturdy until you get close enough to realize how delicate it is. Maybe this is because we use the word literacy to refer to two pretty distinct concepts. Either a binary benchmark, literate versus illiterate, or as a spectrum of skills used to navigate something like the digital world or personal finances. These dueling definitions reflect an evolving understanding of literacy as both a specific skill, like reading music implies a degree of musical literacy, or as a social practice. Reading music is really just a representation of making actual music. And musical literacy may or may not include actually reading music. So we see here that literacy is both kind of a benchmark, you can or you can't, or a spectrum of skills, a set of skills that imply your ability to navigate a certain domain. I started writing this essay and it got long really fast. So in part one, I'm going to unpack both of these definitions of literacy and look at how they impact our thinking. In part two, next month, I'll circle around to a more specific point, that circus, through a confluence of factors, can provide a really specific and extraordinary way of reading and acting on the world around you. Let's begin with the benchmark definition of literacy. This definition emerged in the 1950s as part of a worldwide effort to increase accesses to reading and writing. The original definition emerged from scientific research that was attempting to determine how many people could read or write in a given population. In order to measure this, a simple binary definition of literacy was needed, and so the UNESCO definition, people who can, with understanding, read and write a short, simple statement about their everyday life, was used. Since then, much of the data on worldwide literacy has relied on a simple census question: can you read and write? This definition of literacy is the common one, the seemingly sturdy sandcastle. And there's something undeniably appealing about the simplicity of, can you read or write? The binary contrast here between literate and illiterate creates the benchmark of a skill that needs to be passed. I put here a link to a fascinating and really accessible piece on the history of how we measure literacy, and it starts to point at how this definition of literacy has affected our understanding of literacy. But even the scientists and policymakers who are involved in this research don't take this definition, literate versus illiterate, based on can you read and write, very seriously. We don't have to get very close to this definition to see that it breaks down, that it's pretty unstable. I, for example, can read and write a short sentence about my life in English, but not in French. Does that make me illiterate? Well, you could say it makes me illiterate in French, but then I kind of have to think about it and point out that I can muddle my way through a French sentence. I can guess at the meaning of familiar-looking words and take in contextual clues. So am I really illiterate in French? I can sort of understand. I could muddle my way through writing a sentence. It might not be a good sentence, but I'd be able to do it. So what about my ability to read, say, poetry or Shakespeare? Is it possible that I can read the words but still miss a good deal of the information? At the very least, these examples reveal that literacy is a spectrum of different skills that are related to communication, within which we've placed an arbitrary benchmark that could be higher or lower. Different people in different times and different places might even interpret that benchmark differently. This line of thinking has led to a more interesting definition of literacy, a set of buildable, developable skills that include recognizing information that's in our environment and reacting to or interacting with that information. I want to use the classic examples of reading and writing as an entry point to unpack what this looks like in movement or in physical literacy. Reading and writing are inseparable. One is about perception and the other is about action. While it might seem like perception is a passive thing, it's actually quite directed. It's actually quite active. What we perceive in the world around us and how we perceive it is a developable skill. So let's start with reading. What skills do we use in reading? The first step in reading is to recognize that writing even exists, that the squiggles on a page or the marks on a stone contain special meaning and information. Suppose you've traveled in a country with a different alphabet. In that case, you have a firsthand experience of this. You may recognize that information is present, and you might be able to guess the meaning from context, but you're not exactly sure what it says. You just know that it says something. You can recognize that a sign contains information about whether or not a store is open. And if the store then looks open, you know the sign must say that. The sign must say the store is open. But that's about as far as it goes. In physical literacy, the first step is recognizing that the movement environment that exists all around you contains information that informs how you're going to move, that informs your movement options. These opportunities are called affordances, and we can see architects and other environmental designers using affordances all the time. Elephant paths are a great example. They're kind of hard to explain, so you can look at the picture in a link. Door handle design is a more easily imaginable one. You can tell by a door handle whether or not you can push or pull that door. I also put a link to some hilarious object designs that unmask this idea of affordances by rewriting some common opportunities, like the handle on a mug, as impossible challenges. It's really interesting. You should check it out. In these examples, both walking or picking up a mug, your brain has learned from infancy how to recognize in your environment, I can pick that object up, or I could walk there, as important, salient information. There are also some more subtle places to look for evidence of our ability to read our environment. We can look at anthropology or disability studies, where there is evidence that how we process the raw environmental information that exists around us is actually constructed, not innate. It's not instinctive. There's a fascinating example in a lecture from Lyra Borodowski, I think I'm pronouncing her name right, about the Cook-Theore people in Australia. The Cook-Theore people, in their language, they don't contain the concept of right or left. Instead, they only contain concepts oriented to the cardinal directions. Cook-Theore people read their environment in a very different way from you or I because of this. The direction of shadows in their landscape, which I might ignore, might be unconsciously noticed and logged by them. They don't have a left leg and a right leg. They have a leg that is facing east or a leg that is facing west. And how they'll name their leg is different depending on which direction they're facing. This feature of their language colors more than how they read just their physical environment. It also affects how they conceive of abstract concepts like time. The compelling example from the lecture is an object ordering. When asked to organize pictures of one single person from oldest to youngest, an English speaker would likely place the youngest picture to their left and the oldest to their right, mimicking the direction of writing. Likewise, an Arabic speaker might order the pictures in the other direction, from right to left. But a Cook-Theore person orders the pictures from east to west, regardless of which direction they're facing. So if they're facing south, they'll order the pictures from east to west. If they're facing north, they'll order the pictures from east to west. Consciously or unconsciously, that is an entirely different way of reading their environment. Other examples of how reading our environment is learned rather than innate can be seen in disability studies. Living in a wheelchair is a simple example. A person who lives in a wheelchair for a long period of time will read the slope of the ground and the width of spaces in an entirely different way from me, again, because our attention is directed, usually unconsciously, towards different features of the world around us. These simple examples provide the basis for a larger point. How we read our environment is informed by abstract factors like culture and language, and concrete factors like our body, our capacity, our mood, and maybe even the time of day. all of this occurs through the simple, largely unconscious process of attention. What raw sensory information our brain feeds to our conscious mind about the environment around us. So the first step of reading in physical literacy is actually quite deep and nearly unconscious. The information in the environment that draws our attention, much like how we learn to direct our attention to scribbles on a page when we're learning how to read words. It's one thing to be aware of the presence of this information, but it's another thing to create meaning from that information. The second step in reading a written language is social and interpretive. It's social because it relies on language and communication, and interpretive because all communication is interpretive. For example, take this sentence. John saw the man on the mountain with a telescope. Who has the telescope? The answer is up to interpretation. And without contextual clues, we'll probably never find out. In reading and in physical literacy, it's important to recognize that information doesn't exist outside of its context. For example, it's tempting to believe that the information in this essay exists without context, that this essay is a conduit to some pure realm of ideas where information exists unencumbered by details and context. But this just isn't the case. Your interpretation of the information in this essay doesn't exist outside of this context. Details like our relationship to each other, the font that I've used, the fact that you're listening to the audio recording, the temperature of the room you're in, the speed that you're listening to the recording at, how much time you have right now, where you are, what you're doing, all of these contextual features are informing how you process and interpret the information in this essay. In physical literacy, this interpretive step takes place surrounded by social and cultural codes of conduct. What opportunities for movement are available, and which of those opportunities are socially or culturally feasible? Which of the movements of people around me, or which pieces of information in the environment are socially important to me right now? Gestures and movement and arrangement of rooms play a huge role in communication, and so many gestures have different meanings in different cultures. But the interpretation of movement can go much deeper than that. It can go to the level of our ability to notice movement and assign meaning to it at all. Movement, gesture, and expression are the backbone of something like traveling abroad when you only speak one language. The development of physical literacy includes not only the raw information of what action is possible or what actions other people are conducting around me, but also what action is feasible, socially acceptable, and oriented towards the goal that we want to achieve, such as getting directions or impressing someone with our amazing circus skills. This brings us to the communicative side of literacy, writing, or the physical literacy equivalent of engaging in movement. In the same way that it's easy to conceive of a benchmark for skill in reading or writing, it's easy to conceive of physical literacy as a set of fundamental motor skills like walking, crawling, grasping objects, or other activities involved in daily life. While this is a tempting interpretation with relevant impacts on public health, for example, developing sports skills may increase opportunities for physical activity, it also implies that people who can't complete these benchmarks are somehow physically illiterate. This label, like all labels that focus on deficit, can have consequences for that person's skill development, identity, and self-esteem. It probably isn't the words physically illiterate, actually. No one uses those words in real life. But that label, whatever words are used for that label, persists and it sticks, convincing people that if they don't look a certain way or have certain specific motor skills, then movement just isn't for them. With this framework in mind, I want to turn towards circus education and the development of physical literacy, because the aim of circus education, or of any physical education, is pretty different depending on how we interpret this term, physical literacy. Let's first acknowledge that regardless of whether or not the language physical literacy is known to coaches or teachers or students, most movement education revolves around the first benchmark definition of physical literacy. This is primarily because of the early emphasis on comparative achievement. A movement skill like ball throwing is evaluated on the scale of making a team or scoring a point. And so if you're not in the top 10% of ball throwers in your environment, you're probably considered illiterate at throwing. This isn't exclusive to sports skills either. The same is true in dance, where someone's ability to absorb choreography quickly or behave in a certain way during class creates the same structure of literate and illiterate. You're good at dance or you're not. This is for you or it's not. Whether these exact terms are used isn't relevant. The label gets applied early on and it sticks. In early education, physical literacy is equated with physical achievement. And if you aren't interested in or proficient at whatever skills are valuable in your environment, you begin to construct a deficit identity. I am not physical, sporty, good at dance, or whatever. Circus education is not immune to this pitfall. In fact, the fundamental circus skills like climbing a silk or doing a 3-ball cascade or staying on a tight wire can really easily fall into this achievement trap, especially when coaches or students default to this benchmark definition that exists all around us. In this sense, it's not circus that matters. It's the approach to developing movement. So while circus education doesn't necessarily or automatically avoid the benchmark approach to physical literacy, I do believe that there are factors that make circus education especially well suited to developing the skills involved in the other definition of physical literacy. The circus way of reading or acting on our environment goes much deeper than circus content. And with some ingenuity, this circus way could be applied to any domain of movement teaching. Next month, I'm going to unpack the factors that I believe influence the development of physical literacy skills and how circus education is a confluence of these factors that make it a really great candidate for learning more about how we learn movement or learning more about movement itself. I hope you enjoyed this essay. Please subscribe. And if you're listening and you aren't enrolled in my March cohort, I am doing a 4-week, 8-hour training. And I'd love to have you on board. You can enroll until Tuesday, March 5th. And after that, if you're still interested in it, or if you're interested in working with me, please just check out my courses or other opportunities. You can always send me a DM, and I love to meet new people and talk with you online. Have a great rest of your day.